Welcome to yet another very topical and very timely Met webinar. As most of you are aware, last week, the Islamic Republic of Iran audaciously attempted to kidnap an Iranian American journalist, Masih Alinejad, from her home in Brooklyn, and wanted to rush her back actually to Caracas, Venezuela, and eventually to Tehran via speedboats. An indictment unsealed from a federal court in New York indicates this plot was orchestrated directly by an Iranian intelligence network. This is on top of a long litany of Iran's recent malfeasance, including drone attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq, killing a U.S. contractor, the precariously close trailing of Iranian vessels near U.S. Coast Guard ships in international waters, and the absolutely debasing way that the American delegation has been treated in their attempt to revive the nuclear talks in Vienna, which apparently have reached a deadlock. We have seen that the International Atomic Energy Administration, the IAEA officials, are being denied access to critical nuclear sites in Iran, and that Iran has continued to be behind most of the territorial groups sowing havoc throughout the Middle East. As we know, a horrific hardliner, Ebrahim Raisi, known as the Butcher of Tehran, has been, as Benan likes to say, selected rather than elected to be the Islamic Republic of Iran's next president. Yet it seems as though the Biden administration is planning on lifting all sanctions on Iran, throwing caution to the wind, and proceeding with the nuclear talks as much as they're able to revive the fundamentally flawed JCPOA, the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal. What is behind the single-minded determination? Who are the people in the Biden administration behind this idea? Do they not realize that Iran has been behind some of the most destabilizing events throughout the Middle East in the last several years? In order to answer these questions and more, we're delighted to have with us Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam has actually been with us before, and we were really impressed, and so we're really honored to have him with us again. Behnam is a senior fellow at the wonderful Foundation for Defense of Democracies here in Washington, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and native Farsi skills, Behnam has closely tracked a wide range of Iranian-related topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and international Iranian policies. He's frequently called upon to brief journalists, congressional staff, and other Washington audiences. And Behnam has also testified before the U.S. Congress and the Canadian Parliament. So first of all, Behnam, tell us just a little bit about Ebrahim Raisi, the newly, as you say, selected president of Iran.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Sarah. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with Emmett again. Thanks for taking the time, I think, to really engage in a substantive and important conversation because we're kind of in a waiting period or in a holding pattern right now on several fronts here in Washington as it relates to Iran. And of course, as it relates to the incoming selected Iranian president, Saeed Ebrahim Raisi. Ebrahim Raisi currently serves as the head of Iran's judiciary. He has no famous pre-revolutionary resume that is of note for the audience, but in the post-revolutionary life, you saw him at a very young age, because I believe he's only 60 years old. In the post-revolutionary period in the 1980s, work his way bloodily and mercilessly through the Iranian judiciary, not ending in, but really kind of launching off from, overseeing what is essentially called a death committee in 1988, helping implement two religious edicts, or as they're called, fatwas, of the then founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, basically killing over 5,000 political prisoners and dissidents inside Iran's prisons, which many of whom were already serving lesser sentences. And not only is this gravely unjust, gravely immoral, gravely grotesque, it's also, illegal by Iran's own perverse judicial standards, because many of them were already serving lesser sentences. Unfortunately, Iran has a habit of not only rejecting international law, not only rejecting broad-based human rights norms that most of the civilized world already agrees to, but the Islamic Republic has a history of even turning a blind eye to some of its own laws and regulations. And this is a system that has promoted men like Raisi to the echelons of political power. Now, having won in the 13th, I believe, presidential election, or shall we say selection contest in Iran this past June, he is slated to take office in early August, refill a series of positions, or what we call the constellation of power inside the Islamic Republic, with figures that represent an ultra hardline minority elite inside the Islamic Republic. This is not the smiling, well-dressed clerical garb of the 1990s, where the regime says things to garner a certain disposition or relief or merit or reward from the international community. This is an increasingly minority-led regime, minority in the sense that the elite pool, forget the fact that there is a massive chasm between street and society, or state and society inside Iran, a chasm which we see exploding for over 6 days now inside Khuzestan province and several other places inside Iran, triggered by a water crisis, but also by the growing just political dissatisfaction between Iranians and a government that does not at all represent them. But also is indicative of where things are going to be headed, because this is a regime that not only engages in foreign aggression and domestic suppression, it's also consistently narrowed what it believes is an acceptable elite. And in this case, Raisi represents the hardest of the hardliners. And I would expect this trend of repression at home and aggression abroad to continue under the Raisi presidency. And no commentary, and I know I'm going on here, but no commentary on Raisi can be complete without thinking of an Islamic Republic without the second of the two supreme leaders of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, in his life, because that man is in the 8th decade of his life and the 3rd decade of his career as supreme leader in a regime that is only 4 decades old. So in this sense, with Raisi at the helm, there's been much talk of him as a potential future supreme leader. But even if he's not a potential future supreme leader, talk of him as president of Iran, because every president in the post-revolutionary period since the mid-80s has served 2 terms. He, given Khamenei's lifespan, Khamenei again is 82, would likely preside over transition of power at a very critical time for the regime, economically, socially, politically, and almost on every other front. So, as always, it's a critical time for Iran and in the Middle East, and of course, for U.S. policy and that of our allies.
Well, we know that Hussein Rouhani will tell us, in effect, Hussein Rouhani, I always thought, was a wolf in sheep's clothing. And how different do you feel the reign of Raisi will be from the reign of Rouhani? Tell us a little bit about, for example, freedom of the press under Rouhani's regime.
Well, much of the gradations of the Iranian political system, there's these words thrown around there like moderate or hardliner or reformist, but basically you should think of the system as first and foremost a hardline system. Whatever flank you are in, there are of course multiple factions, very Byzantine bureaucratic internal and factional politics inside Iran. It has a competitive authoritarian system, but one that has become increasingly less competitive as the regime feels more comfortable narrowing the pool of already a very hardline elite. So whether you're the 1990s era reformists, which have essentially lost all political power and are deep in the wilderness, whether you're that group, or you are the group represented by the likes of the known anti-Semite former president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which in a very perverse way, that man, that former Holocaust denier-in-chief, now constitutes the political science definition of domestic opposition inside Iran. You should see the things that Ahmadinejad says and tweets and does interviews about. The man has done a 180. He's got an oddly Islamist populist disposition, trying to chip away at some of the regime's already dwindling hardline base inside the country. So it's a very interesting situation when you look at Iran's internal politics. But the most important thing to take away for the audience is that whatever flank you are on, the spectrum is contracting. And this is not a bug of the regime. This is a feature of the regime, because the supreme leader has worked overtime to constantly narrow the social and political acceptable boundaries for speech, for political thought, for political space, for political representation. And again, whatever flank you find yourself on, these are people who are willing to serve as the shield or the mask, or to serve as lipstick on a pig for this sort of regime. So whether you call yourself a reformer or a hardliner, you are electing or choosing or opting into this sort of regime with this sort of background, with this sort of process. And again, you could not have designed at this point in time, 42 years on, a system that is fundamentally more different from the values and strategies and ideals of the Iranian people. You see a rather tattered, but I would still like to say impressive bookshelf behind me. One book I'd recommend for many to read is Days of God by James Buchan. I think it's published in the mid 2013-14 era. It has, I think, the best line about the 1979 revolution in Iran, which is the revolution that birthed this system. And the line is, what the Iranians most sought to preserve, they lost, and what they wished for, they never attained. I hope I didn't butcher that line. But indeed, I think that is true.
Right. So tell us why the regime is so incredibly threatened by this small Iranian-born activist and journalist, Masih Alinejad.
Well, this is a regime that believes that equality between the sexes is not only just some sort of grave sin, but a national security crisis. This is the sort of regime that cracks down on people who are protesting for not having access to water. This is the sort of regime that constantly narrows its already very hardline elite. And this is the sort of regime, and that I want to stress for our American audience here, at the height of indirect nuclear diplomacy in Europe to restore a fatally flawed and fast expiring nuclear deal that is already heavily slanted in their favor. This is a regime that feels comfortable reaching onto U.S. soil to abduct and kidnap an American citizen. When you look at what Masih Alinejad has said, both when she left the country and on social media and on her news shows and on her articles and things she's been quoted in, she's talking about equality. She's talking about giving a voice for the voiceless, all the mothers and families who have lost sons and daughters and kids and relatives inside the multiple iterations of peaceful protests in Iran that have been violently repressed in the past few years. This is what she's doing. She's giving a voice to the voiceless. And in many ways, she's a patriot. And this is a regime that is Islamist in disposition, not nationalist in disposition. So I want to stress that for our audience. And the second thing I want to stress about that long reach of Iran, we may think that this is new. Well, this could be part of the incoming Raisi phenomenon. This is not. This is part of the nature of the regime. In 1980, Iran used a disaffected American convert to Islam to try to, and actually successfully, kill a former Shah-era diplomat here in the suburbs of DC in Maryland. In 2011, Iran used a washed-up used car salesman in Texas, I believe, who had ties to the Quds Force to try to contact the Zetas, a Mexican drug cartel, to aid in the attempted assassination of the former Saudi ambassador to Washington in a crowded Italian restaurant in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Fortunately, that plot was thwarted because the Zetas, or the Mexican contact that the individual thought he was reaching out to, ended up being drug enforcement agents, individuals. And so the plan was stopped. And in this case, the FBI and the DOJ has unsealed and revealed an indictment against one Iranian woman in California who was alleged in the allegedly aided in the distribution of the money to hire what is apparently an American private intelligence firm to stalk Masih Alinejad, who is a peaceful dissident and is a U.S. citizen living here in New York, in Brooklyn, and to try to kidnap her, and for the rest of the press release to do things that you could only read in some crazy spy novel. So the regime has a long history of trying to engage in this long reach onto American soil. And while some analysts may like to say, Ebrahim, that's 1980, that's 2011, that's 2021. Those are instances separated by big gaps in time. Clearly, the regime has been deterred by America. I think when you take a holistic or a macro view of this regime's intention and ideologies and capabilities, while some of its capabilities you might laugh off or think amateurish, the regime keeps trying. And what that really does mean is that the regime is not deterred in these periods of time. The regime is constantly trying to find workarounds to continue to export its revolution and to continue to engage in the same kind of terror it engages in at home abroad.
Okay, so right now we know that at least in certain provinces of Iran, there is a water revolution going on. Our people are upset because they are using, the regime is taking the water. There's a drought. They need it for their drinking water. They need it for their agricultural products. But there's been precious little media coverage about this in the West. And I know that the regime does have a media blackout. What can you tell us about this? What have you seen? I know that in the western province of Khuzestan, they're trying to get some message out. And is there a potential that this can spread and develop into something bigger?
I think this definitely has the potential to keep growing. I would certainly remind audiences that from 2017 to 2020, you've seen multiple iterations of protests in Iran, protests not triggered by a political phenomenon, in the past, such as during the peak periods of the reform movement, where you could say the reform movement was politically active and had a large social following or social base inside the country, like in the 90s or 2000s. In 1999, in response to the closing of a reformist newspaper, for instance, there were protests in Tehran University and across Tehran that were violently repressed, including the storming of student dorms in Tehran University. Those were part of the reformist movement. Then 2009, of course, everyone remembers the Green Movement, the Green Revolution, the chant, "Where is my vote?" But last year, I was part of a team of individuals doing an academic and analytical study of these protests. And really, the 1999 and 2009 represent the end of the reformist era protests and the transformation of the Iranian people seeking reform into the Iranian people directly seeking and coveting revolution. And that's the thing to take away from the 2017 to present protests. So even though the trigger to our audience may seem non-economic, like you mentioned, a water grievance, a grievance in a largely minority province. Khuzestan has a large majority of ethnic Arabs. This is not the only lens with which to see these protests. I think that the major lens is to see them as connected to the 2017 to 2020 protests, because they're all about contesting central authority that is not just corrupt and incompetent, but central authority that is governing the country in an Islamist and revolutionary fashion, when the vast majority of the population, regardless of their ethnic disposition and regardless of their background, is not Islamist, is nationalist, and is not revolutionary, is actually post-revolutionary. So this is a big thing to take away.
That's a great takeaway. So if you actually had the power to help these protesters, what would you recommend that the United States government do?
Well, there's a lot to do. I think, working with a major public-private partnership needs to be underway. I hope it's underway. I don't have any evidence of it being underway, of making sure that the Iranians have access to the internet, particularly when there are periods of time when there are attempts to cut out the internet. In 2019, December 2019, you saw, I think, a 6 or 7 day internet blackout inside that country. The Washington Post has a saying, which is "democracy dies in the darkness." Back then, when there was a massive violence, the worst violence ever seen against Iranian protesters since the 1979 revolution, I came up with a hybrid paraphrase saying that, well, Iranians too are dying in the darkness. So I think it's an imperative for the U.S. government, Republican or Democrat, isolationist or internationalist, whatever disposition the current or future administrations may have, to find a way through public-private partnerships to make sure that Iranians have access to internet. This is the strategically sound thing. This is the morally right thing for Iranians to not only be able to communicate with each other through whatever technical means are needed, but to as well bypass the major filtering networks that they have, and also when there are internet shutouts, to try to find surrogate ways to provide those services, to get their story out there so that their story can be told. This is critical. Always taking your cues politically from the street is the second thing I would do, to look at the slogans, to understand what the slogans mean. This is key, and I don't think that this current administration is doing that. The third thing is to realize where the protests are actually happening and use sanctions in a highly targeted fashion to go after the political, military, and law enforcement elite inside those provinces on a very localized level, to sanction the Revolutionary Guard and Besiege and law enforcement forces and police and vigilante commanders who are literally on the grounds from province to province. This stuff is relatively public information. Engage in a targeted sanctions campaign, freezing the assets and naming and shaming these individuals who are leading a crackdown against their own compatriots, and instead should really be laying down their own arms and joining their compatriots. So this is also what I would do if I was in the U.S. government. And I think lastly, this is beyond the scope of this, but as much as you could assist the Iranian people with having this communication capability, you would want to impede the Iranian government from having a communication capability, because the lesson, when you look not at the people but at the regime from 2017 to present, is that the majority of the time their security apparatus and their capability to crack down is very cohesive and very powerful. So you'd want to find ways to weaken that.
Right. With this government's obsession with returning to the JCPOA, what likelihood do you feel that there is of going and helping actually these freedom-loving revolutionaries on the streets? And I had read that the government is our government is planning on lifting the sanctions on Ebrahim Raisi as an inducement to keep negotiating. As you know, the regime has now said that they want to hold off on further negotiations until early August, when Raisi assumes office. Who is it in the Biden administration that is so single-minded in its determination to return to the fatally flawed JCPOA and lift the sanctions, and essentially reward Iran for all of its malign activities throughout the region? Is it the entire administration? Are there certain individuals you could point to? And how can we possibly get through to them?
I think this is more of a holistic than an individual issue, both politically, because unfortunately the Iran issue, with the advent of the JCPOA in 2015, became more of a partisan issue between multiple communities of concern and constituencies in Washington, as well as across America, as well as, of course, perhaps most importantly, in the corridors of Capitol Hill. The Iran issue, when you looked at past sanctions resolutions flying out of their 98-1 or 99-0, I don't believe we're returning to those days of a bipartisan consensus on Iran. I think when you see the kind of fracturing of our national politics, Iran is a footnote to that larger and sadder story that we're all kind of watching on a national scale here. So in this sense, from a policy perspective and a political perspective, I think the Biden team is interested in JCPOA resurrection, interested to vindicate the Obama approach and to repudiate the Trump approach. That is, I think, the big driver. A big contrast I see, actually, between the Biden approach and the Trump approach is not just, obviously, sanctions and the pressure and the comfortability with sanctions. It's not that. A contrast that actually involves personnel. You talked about, who, I can't pinpoint who, but, a very big 50,000-foot difference on this issue is the difference between the presidents, the men themselves. there was a lot of Kremlinology going on in Washington in the past 40 years, trying to figure who's up, who's down, who are the hawks on Iran, who are the doves, who are the behavior change folks, who are the regime change folks, who are more internationalist, who are more isolationist, who is Trump listening to on a given day. But if you really, in the past 4 years, wanted to know anything about U.S. policy, you just have to keep your eye on one man and one thing, Trump and his Twitter feed. That is the closest thing. And perhaps the most accurate thing when it came to U.S. policy that we had. And so the president had a very decided view. In fact, if you remember, prior to Trump even becoming president, when he campaigned, he differentiated himself from a lot of the other Republican candidates by saying he wouldn't leave the deal on day one. And he framed the Iran issue through this larger, quote unquote, deal maker persona, whatever you want to make of that he would get a better deal, that this is the capability that he could, quote unquote, uniquely offer Washington. So that's something to take into effect, the president's strong view. Here, there's a lot of other individuals, so there's a lot of talented people, capable people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. They have views, they share these views, they write about them, they've written about them in the past, they're on TV, constantly talking about them. You also have people like Rob Malley. Rob Malley is perhaps, I think, very instrumental with the JCPOA-centric or JCPOA first, or what you would call, in my view, JCPOA-only approach to the Iran threat network and the Iranian challenge for U.S. national security policy. But ultimately, these folks in some ways are more public on the issue than the president. And I think a sharp contrast is where the president really is. You could clearly see that President Biden being forceful and out there and kind of personally involved with other foreign policy issues like the Afghan drawdown decision. Whereas I can't necessarily pinpoint the president's personal views on Iran in a way that you could very easily pinpoint Trump's personal views on Iran. So this is one thing to take away. And the other is the shared view that it is best to deal with the nuclear issue first and in isolation from the larger threats. I have I understand where this comes from because European negotiators and European diplomats would tell me constantly when I would talk to them under the peak periods of max pressure, you could say, that America's quest and my view that this should be a comprehensive approach to Iran is functionally difficult for a lot of national capitals to get off the ground because of the way their national security councils are more functionally rather than regionally prioritized. And also that if everything is a priority, they don't know how to prioritize, well, what's the first amongst equals for the priority? So bureaucratically, a lot of capitals didn't know how to have a counter-Iran policy. And in fact, they critiqued America's comprehensive attempt at a counter-Iran policy. I certainly think we could have been better in the past too. But the people at the helm now making the big picture decisions believe it should not be comprehensive. It should be layered like a wedding cake. And they're over focusing on that top layer of the wedding cake, the part that you save for your anniversary the next year. And they believe that the nuclear issue defines the Iran threat. They believe it's the most urgent. But in many ways, Iran is adept at constantly raising things that are always deemed as the most urgent or the next most urgent. And in this way, they get you to not focus on the initial qualm you had with them. They get you to try to put out a series of fires, and in so doing, have tactics masquerade as strategy. And that's one larger fear I have for the Biden team, that they would lose all their leverage in the quest to get this deal and have an Iran policy that is almost defined by an arms control policy, which, as we said, is a fatally flawed one.
Right. Okay. So do you think that there are any red lines within the Biden administration? I mean, we've seen Iran just cross all these red lines, and there's been, no statement whatsoever from the Biden administration. Okay, we can't proceed any further. This is enough. Are there any red lines?
This is an excellent question. In fact, I was talking to some folks earlier this morning about it, and I framed it as an open question. What are their red lines if the Iranians on the nuclear file are not just abrogating and surpassing JCPOA limits, but they're actually transgressing much more important foundational non-proliferation tenets like the additional protocol and, dare I say, the non-proliferation treaty? What are our regional red lines when we talk about first nuclear, then regional, if we have absorbed 26 different rocket and drone attacks since Biden came into office in Iraq alone. And in Iraq alone, only responded with force twice. I'm not counting Syria because I believe, most administrations, Trump and Biden, are treating it like a free fire zone when there is a greater cost to responding militarily in Iraq. So where is the red line in the region there? Where is the red line when you have a group that walks like a terrorist, acts like a terrorist, talks like a terrorist? And I'm talking about the Houthis in Yemen, also known as Ansarullah, who have moved closer to Iran, who have been the biggest beneficiaries of Iranian weaponry. Iran has given the Houthis in Yemen missile and military capabilities that no other proxy or partner has ever received in the past 4 decades. And yet, one of the first things the administration does is delist the Houthis from the foreign terrorist organizations list managed by the State Department. So I'm at a loss to explain what the actual red lines are. There's always, of course, this talking point. Multiple administrations had it, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, that they will never let the regime get a nuclear weapon. I certainly hope they work to defend that, but I certainly hope they broaden their definition of the Iran threat to looking at the world and looking at the regime as it actually is and not as they wish it to be.
Colleagues in the Jerusalem Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, just came out with a report yesterday saying that Iran is only 6 weeks away from nuclear breakout. If these talks reach a deadlock and they're nowhere, and we see how close Iran is to nuclear breakout, do you think that knowing the makeup of the Biden administration, if ultimately Israel has to take the ultimate step to defend its state, do you think that the United States would help Israel?
I certainly think we are, despite the dwindling timeline for breakout, I certainly think we are far from that proposition, given, of course, things that we've seen in Iran, like the summer of 2020, which was the summer of sabotage against a series of missile, military, and perhaps most importantly, nuclear centers. I don't think, not to sidestep your question, but I don't think the Israeli approach is at the moment the air power approach that was applied to Iraq in 81, Syria in 2007, or Uganda even previously. These are all things that happen with no media coverage, as in there is a radio silence on the threat that happens before. And then there is this very significant tactical military operation that is carried out against one specific area, whether it's a rescue attempt, as in Entebbe, or a strike, as we saw in Syria and Iraq. I think the Israelis know the breadth and the depth of the program. What we've seen Iranian intelligence officials even say is that regime officials in Iran, former intelligence officials have been saying this in Iran publicly, in Persian, in their own press, that regime officials ought not to sleep easy at night, given how punctured their national security establishment is by the Israelis. So I don't see the Israelis defaulting to the past approach that many analytically have tried to stereotype as just air power against an evolving threat inside a rogue regime. But, philosophically, would the administration have Israel's back? It depends on very much what you mean by that. Would it join in airstrikes? I don't think the U.S. is in the mood currently, not because of politics, but nationally. And the U.S. seems to be very much disengaging from the region, and I am very much worried about what that means for the U.S. allies. Hopefully, they'll be able to work together more, even if the U.S. continues to, I think, somewhat foolishly reduce its already economy of force missions and military installations in the region. But I think ultimately, we won't know. And I think the important thing to know is that thus far, the Israeli MO is not, they're talking about this threat, but their behavior, I think, if you do believe that some of these acts of sabotage are carried out by foreign intelligence operations, likely Israel, but, again, not definite. This seems to be the MO.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. Now I have the pleasure of turning this over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who is the director of AMET's program for emerging democratic voices from out of the Middle East. Hussein?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Benham, for such an extremely insightful and interesting insights into the situation in Iran. We've received actually a lot of questions, so we'll try to get to all of them as the time allows. The first question that we have is, how much actual popular support does the regime have domestically?
It's a very important question. You know, this question has been answered kind of non-empirically and anecdotally in a similar fashion in the past 2 decades. But I think that non-empirical and anecdotal answer should be even more narrowly scoped. You know, people have always said anywhere from 15 to 30%. Given the part of the population that does turn out, that is reliant on some subsidies. But ultimately, I think what you're seeing is even the generation that the regime had put its stock into, you know, the urban and rural poor, the quote unquote downtrodden and dispossessed people that I thought it could buy off its subsidies, they have been leading. It's been more blue collar protests from 2017 to present in the outside in approach of Iran's protests. So, you know, that very back of the envelope calculation of 15 to 30% is there, but I think dwindling. You know, the issue inside Iran is not just what is the percent or what is the breakdown of regime support versus not regime support. It's the issue of, well, what do the constituencies that do and don't support actually do? And I think now what you're seeing with more and more protests is that even as the regime is contracting, you have people being more comfortable with coming out and being able to take, as we mentioned before, these non-political crises and use any vector possible to share their dissatisfaction with the regime and to make it highly public. So if you're a policymaker in Washington formulating Iran policy in a vacuum from this massive chasm between state and society and these increasing number of protests and the dwindling level of support for the regime, you're making an Iran policy that is designed to fail.
The second question that we have, actually somewhat related to the last one, given the current contraction of the regime, how realistic is it to expect some sort of regime change in the future?
Well, if we're talking about contraction the way I am, which is the political contraction of the elite, because this is not a popular regime, this is a regime that used to have a wide elite. It's, you know, the revolution was brought to you by a very wide coalition of forces. Some liberal, Marxist, nationalist, intellectual, leftist, Islamist, Marxist, hard Islamist. There was a very broad coalition. They were united in really one thing, which is to take out the Shah and end the monarchy. And then from there on, they had many disagreements. But what the hardest of the hardline flank, the Islamist flank, did is they used foreign and domestic crises to pick off their opponents. And then even when they got to the range of Islamists, they are now narrowing that. To many, mistakenly, they see this narrowing as a symbol of strength. And in fact, they say max pressure or the former administration's policy is the root cause of this. Not only is this incorrect, it denies the actual hardliners in Iran agency of their structure, of their plan to actually make a system that represents their views, their warped ideology and their warped worldviews. And I think perhaps worse, it reads weakness as strength. I was just talking to some of my colleagues about this. One of my colleagues actually, we're working on a couple of larger pieces together, but he was born and raised in Iran, and he actually was in Evin prison of course, what many many people who wanted to be politically active in their youth have suffered. And him and I were talking about this issue. And we were saying that it's a misrepresentation to see it as strength. It's because it's actually a weakness. It's a coarsening, it's a hardening, but it's a hardening because they have run out of options, because they themselves don't trust the elite around them. So that's why the space for political, for political space shrinks, and ultimately means they have a smaller and smaller pool of people. And while it looks like they're more cohesive, and that cohesion is misread by some as a strength, it's actually a weakness because they have less men to carry out these orders. And fundamentally, when you have that gap between state and society and less of an elite that may be willing to kill to stay in power, then you really do have a problem.
Right. Our next question is, there are some claims that the United States, or at least this administration, seeks to transform Iran into a partner in its Middle East policy and security commitments. A recent statement of such nature was made by former Secretary Pompeo. How true is this, and how does it affect the situation of the Iranian regime?
It's certainly something that is not said, rhetorically or directly, but it's something that is implied by both the behavior of the second-term Obama administration and implied by the behavior of the first-term Biden administration. It's something that we see, and it's a reticence and it's a fear that U.S. allies and partners in the region definitely share. And it's a fear that is driven by behavior, because if you're ultimately rewarding a regime that does all these things in the region with cash, well, obviously they're going to do more of these things in the region because they were able to sustain some of those things, even though as their cash reserves dwindled. So this is really, I think, a major problem. I don't think it's some immediate, direct, nefarious plot to shake hands with the Iranians, but I think ultimately what the administration wants is in some ways what academics saw the end of the Vietnam War being about, which is a decent interval. That's called the decent interval theory. America ultimately, whether you look at this from Democratic or Republican perspectives over the past decade, is looking to disengage from the region. There is increased popular support for that disengagement from the region. There is also increased popular support for a hardening or growing of the U.S. military force presence in the Asia Pacific, and an overfocus on the China threat. Now, I'm not saying that Iran is a greater threat than China, but it is imperative that I think Washington counter both and understand that great power competition certainly has a regional element to that. And countering Iran in the region can also do much for you to also counter China's long tentacles and long reach out of East Asia and South Asia and into the Middle East. So that addresses that. But I think the Biden administration wants that decent interval. They just kind of want to kick the can down the road. They want to placate the Iranians enough just to have some of the urgent threats go away, because I don't think they're interested, at least based on their behavior, I don't think they're interested in resolving the Iran issue. I think they're interested in managing it by trying to buy off the Iranians. And it didn't work in the past, and I don't think it'll work in the future.
Thank you. What is the size of the IRGC's economic power in and outside of Iran?
Well, the connection is actually both. Their capability to reach abroad, their various fronts, their various business engines and holding companies do tie into foreign markets. That's how you saw even under peak periods of multilateral pressure. Under the Obama administration, Iran was able to use sanctions circumvention and sanctions busting networks to generate illicit revenue through oil sales that were ship-to-ship transfers, things of that nature. But inside Iran, once you take that sanction circumventing structure, once you take those fronts and procurement networks and business networks, where in places that the Iranians like to go shopping in, which is Central and Eastern Europe or Southern and Eastern Asia, for instance, those are key jurisdictions where you've seen multiple Iranian procurement and proliferation front networks active and money laundering front networks active in the past. You transpose that back inside Iran, you realize that the most important economic engine, while obviously it's a state-led economy, it's an oil-based economy, the most important economic engine are the various IRGC conglomerates. We got to a very interesting point in 2018, and this is just a brief tangent, where the bazaar, the actual marketplace, souk in Arabic, bazaar in Persian, but the actual individual vendor-led marketplace. The bazaar in Tehran is the biggest bazaar in the Middle East, I think even bigger than Istanbul. It's multiple zip codes, multiple districts. Different bazaars in different cities in Iran were really the private sector engine for the past half century, from the year 1500 to really 1979. And bazaris really did help bankroll the 1979 Islamic Revolution. But the role of the bazaar in Iran's economic life and in the private sector has drastically gone down with the rise of parastatal institutions that basically function as slush funds for Iran's supreme leader. These are called bonyads, they're called foundations. And of course, the fact that the IRGC is prolific in the Iranian economy, prolific in the oil sector, prolific in the construction sector, prolific in sectors that are tied to supporting through their revenue generation Iran's ballistic and cruise missile program, as well as other military adventures. So the IRGC, despite initially being a military force, is a very significant economic force to be reckoned with. And they're not just the guys with the guns, they're also the guys with the money.
Thank you. We now have a question about Lebanon. Are there any implication at all of Raisi's election on the situation in Lebanon? Does that change anything, or doesn't it change anything? And also, will the Iranian policy in Lebanon change as the economy sink even further in Lebanon?
I certainly agree with the analysis. Lebanon is really on track for a major economic meltdown, and my heart goes out really to all the citizens of that country that have dealt with everything from water shortages, electricity shortages, to trash not being collected, to food and medicine shortages. It's a phenomenon you see in places where there is a major element tied to the Islamic Republic of Iran. As the past administration said, the longest suffering victims of the Islamic Republic are the Iranian people themselves. That's certainly true. But you look at these jurisdictions where Iran has exported its revolution, or where it has proxies, or where its tentacles are far-reaching, places like Lebanon, places like Yemen, places like Iraq. Those are not nice places to live. And Iran is in many ways fighting to the last Arab. And that's a phrase many analysts have said before. I think it's certainly correct. It's part of Iran's larger proxy strategy. And the whole point is to have conflict be away from Iranian territory, and to not have to go through major conventional conflicts, and to use and pervert other national political systems like the Iraqi political system or the Lebanese political system, or take advantage of ongoing military conflicts such as the war in Yemen for the regime's own gain. And in many ways, the biggest losers are the people in those war zones or living in those countries. And really, when you talk about the financial meltdown, no country best exemplifies it other than Lebanon, given the future that many credible international economists have predicted for that country if it remains on this track. Raisi's election, or quote unquote selection, will have nothing to do with it. What will significantly expedite the power of Hezbollah and the role of Hezbollah, which is Iran's most successful proxy, inside that country, and continue to keep this stasis of economic trepidation going, is if there is a major infusion of cash to Iran in the future. Because when that trickles down to the proxy network, it's going to be Lebanese Hezbollah that will grow to kind of rival that state. People have talked about it being a state within a state. And as you have state collapse, you have the rise of this proxy. And in many ways, people think just because Iran has all these hotspots in the region that they function as Vietnams. Yes, these are expensive places for Iran to pour money and resources into, and these are things that the Iranian people have specifically pointed out when they go onto the streets protesting, saying, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran, or forget Syria, think about us. They have specifically chosen to critique Iran's economic investment and foreign and security policy in these areas, rather than prioritizing the welfare of the average Iranian at home. You could consider this basically an Iran first kind of nationalist protest inside the country. But ultimately, these proxy wars, these are weapons of the weak. And it's why Iran has been able to sustain them for so long. And it's a strategy that has worked for the Islamic Republic. So as I would expect things to get worse, not better.
And is there anything the U.S. or Israel can do about Lebanon?
It really depends, because there are different time horizons. There's different threats. I think if you're going to, for instance, I don't take this tiered approach, but if you do take the administration's tiered approach and you transpose it to, the military threat rather than the economic one, just to switch for a second, something that you'd be concerned about, Israel just had to fight another war, basically brought to by Iran's proliferation of long-range strike capabilities, rockets, drones, these kind of things, to terrorists in Gaza. But ultimately, there was the brief border fire during the May war from Lebanon, and there was also just reports recently of brief border fire again from Lebanon. And something that the Israelis have been hyper-focused on is the Iranian evolution of its footprint in the Levant, because it's trying to take things from a quantitative perspective and turn it into a qualitative advantage. We know quantitatively, all of Iran's proxies and militias have essentially encircled Israel. That's the quantitative. And Iran has given rockets to some of these groups, groups like Lebanese Hezbollah. There's reports anywhere from 100 to 150,000 rockets in their arsenal. But what Iran is proliferating across the heartland of the Middle East and taking advantage of these failed states like Iraq and Syria is to have and erect and sustain this land bridge to supplement its air bridge, to not only back the Assad regime, but to also give capabilities that are not as big as an actual rocket or missile, but that are gyroscopes, finlets, things of this nature that can transform a rocket, which is an unguided munition, into a precision guided munition or into a missile, which would give those terrorist forces that encircled Israel a qualitative and not just a quantitative advantage. This is something in the realm of the urgent threat, because it's ongoing and it's been evolving since 2015-16. but it's something to keep in mind. And what the Israelis have been doing is striking consistently at these delivery points, these major command and control centers, these arms depots. The question is, how long can this mowing of the grass keep going on? And, I deliberately sidestepped the economic question because there is a robust debate, outside of the administration over, do you support the state, even though the state has a major Iranian dependency, or do you let the state collapse? The U.S. has this exact same debate, but to a much lesser scale in Iraq, where there are obviously pro-Iran elements in that state and anti-Iran elements in that state. And do you support the state in an attempt to actually fight off that pro-Iran element? Or do you let the state weaken because ultimately that the pro-Iran element is the ascendant element, is the powerful element? So if you support the state, are you actually just creating a vassal for that pro-Iran element to take over? It's a very vigorous debate, it's a contentious debate, and it's an unresolved debate. So that is one that I won't weigh into now.
Yeah, it's definitely, there are no easy answers, it seems, for this. Another question that we have, given the situation in the Middle East in general and the current American administration, is there any cohesive strategy for the Arab Gulf states in countering Iranian power? And what are the prospects of a formal Arab-Israeli alliance in the region?
I think regardless of, remember I talked about the Iran threat being politics and policy, that the overfocus on the JCPOA result of the nexus between politics and policy for the Biden team. Somewhere where I don't see this nexus between politics and policy is actually, things like the Abraham Accords. Something that I think the Biden team needs to take from the Trump team and build on is this kind of warming of ties between Israel and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. It's absolutely critical, for instance, that you can facilitate the diplomatic and economic and social interaction and engagement there, particularly given the fact that they have this, rising threat perception of a revolutionary Islamic Republic spreading its tentacles and exporting and proliferating weapons across the region that threatens both their security. When you look at American foreign policy, to layer on the American component now, because this is the shared Arab-Israeli perspective, when you look at the American perspective, it's always better to have your partners be more cohesive and be talking to each other. There's a ton, if there is that kind of sustained trust and sustained interaction and engagement that the Israelis could provide in terms of air and missile defense. Israel has one of the best air and missile defense systems. It's layered, it's multi-tiered, it's actually capable, it's combat proven. That would significantly benefit these countries, which could be subject to more drone and missile attacks in the future. That Iran has launched these attacks through its proxy networks in Iraq as well as Yemen against infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, for instance. And Iran's entire strategy towards these Gulf states is very important to elucidate, because Iran is trying to get these states to leave their strongly anti-Iran stance and not necessarily immediately embrace Iran, but all Iran really wants is, and it's very sinister, because Iran knows how to try to manipulate political winds and play to threat perceptions that already exist in this region. Because traditionally these states have been both balancers and bandwagoners, given their size, given their geographic proximity, given historic ties. It's very difficult to be a strategic decision maker in the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and Riyadh, everywhere really, given the proximity and given the sustained historical ties. So ultimately, Iran is trying to encourage these regimes to hedge away from the American position by saying that America doesn't have your back, and hedge towards the Iranian position by saying, look at our military capabilities, look at our evolution in Shia militia capabilities, look at the long-range strike capabilities, and to frighten them into being less robust in their contestation of Iranian power, and to frighten them and make them move away from the Israelis and move away from the Americans. It's time America double down on these alliances in the region, continue to support them politically and militarily and economically, but also it's time that the Israelis and Arabs got closer together. And I think that this really is a winning formula, and it's also a winning formula for the Biden team talks about foreign policy for middle class. This is it. It's getting your allies to do more together.
And how likely do you think that those Arab states will actually be frightened the way that Iran wants them to be?
I think there are already signs that Iran's strategy is working. I remember very vividly, for instance, Rouhani's 2019 UNGA speech. They deliver the speech in Persian, but there is one kind of Arab colloquial maxim he sprinkled in there, and I'm going to butcher it, even though I have a few years of MSA under my belt, which is Adar thumma ajar, which is first the neighbor, then the house. And ultimately, Rouhani is speaking to the GCC audience here, and he's trying to say that you guys are trying to protect your house, but you should really be protecting your neighbor, because in attempts to protect your house, in an attempt to defend, the GCC states, you brought in the American presence, but really the American presence is the one aggravating Iran. So take the Americans out, and you'll be totally fine with us. But this is really a recipe for Iranian hegemony of the region. It's really a recipe for the regime to restore domination. And I fear that, given that these states have historical patterns of bandwagoning and balancing, and that jurisdictions like the UAE, even under peak periods of max pressure, has been a major front for sanctions busting and even petrochemical sales for the Iranians to generate illicit revenues, that they could be induced. And that's why I think strong leadership from Washington is essential.
Right. I want to apologize for our audience that we're about to run out of time, so we're not going to be able to go through all the questions. So the last question that we're going to ask is, what is the Iranian strategy in Latin and South America, and what is the United States doing to counter them there?
This is really an excellent strategy, because as you've seen the regime be increasingly comfortable with hard power and sectarianism in the heartland of the Middle East. These are things transformed by the region, the U.S. Wars in the region, Afghanistan, Iraq, the breaking of major states, the removing of checks on Iran in the region. Then, of course, the Arab Spring, the collapse of central authority in some countries. Then the ISIS phenomenon. Then, of course, increased military presence in the region. You've seen Iran try to capitalize on all of this. And as it did, Iran, which is a conventionally militarily weak state, but asymmetrically militarily strong state, feel increasingly comfortable with escalation and military force and hard power. And with that came an increasing comfortability to push its sectarian agenda. When you look at these outer environs, whether it's South Asia, the Balkans or Central Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and just as your question mentioned, South America, critically, Iran still has that. It's still sectarian, but it has that ecumenical outreach. It's literally believes it is fighting for Muslim hearts and minds, and it is preying on anti-imperialist language inside those countries. It is preying on native and restive and local populations who have different views about central authority in their countries. It is trying actually very hard to win over converts, first to Islam, then it'll open up like a cultural center. There's a very nefarious role that some of my colleagues have exposed of this entity called the Al-Mustafa University. It has fronts everywhere. The tri-border area is one where Iran uses and abuses members of the Lebanese diaspora to continue to funnel money for Hezbollah so that its chief proxy can have money even under peak periods of maximum pressure. This was the case. So ultimately, Iran is playing the long game in Latin America, and it's kind of a more akin to the Soviet approach than to other great power rival approaches, which is to play the long game, win over things, culturally, religiously, politically, and then militarily, kind of in that order, and make these countries, which are, some of them are jurisdictions of weak central authority, zones where Iranian intelligence and other capabilities can easily penetrate to lay the groundwork for more open future economic and military and political ties. So it's something to watch in the long run, and I hope that the U.S. government is.
Okay, I can't thank you enough, Behnam, for your brilliance, your wisdom on this issue once again. And I'm sure we're going to be turning to you in the future. And we'd like to thank FDD for sharing your brilliance. And if people would like to support FDD, they have a phenomenal group of scholars that we often call upon and rely upon for wisdom. You could go to fdd.org. Beyond that, I have to say, in terms of the Venezuela-Iranian access, we've done a tremendous amount of work. It's very, very scary. I think, right underneath our noses on the southern border, we are watching a buildup, not so unlike what the Iranians did, surrounding Israel with Hezbollah, etc. So for all of the neo-isolationists, who feel that this is just something out there and it only involves the Middle East, the Gulf states, and Israel, watch this spot, really. I also have to say that next week, I'm really honored to have a dear old friend of mine, Walid Faris, who is Lebanese and a Lebanese Christian who I've been working with since I think the early 90s, when I was fortunate enough to write the Syria Accountability Act and work with him on that and the Lebanese Accountability Act. And he really knows what's going on in terms of the horrific situation in Lebanon, which does seem like it's on the verge of collapse. So tune in next week, and I would like to ask our viewers to please support our work. We have this view that, a well-informed public can trickle up to well-informed policymakers, and we all do this free, at our own expense and for the edification of the viewing public out there. So whatever you can to contribute to AMIT, just go to amitonline.org. We appreciate every single dollar. And we're not a wealthy organization, and it means a great deal to us. Anyway, thank you. Thank you once again, Benham, for the wonderful work that you do.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Sarah, Emmett, all the staff, and everyone who asked really great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to have enough time to answer all of them. Traditionally, given that I'm a long-winded speaker, I know that quantity is a quality of its own, but I hope I tried to answer those few questions I did with a significant amount of quality information. And I strongly second what you just ended with, which is the power of an informed public. Information is a weapon, and knowledge really is a blessing.
Well, no worries. You went above and beyond, Benham. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our viewers who tuned in today. Signing off now. Okay.